And welcome back to the Wake Up Challenge. And as always, I'm Adya. This week, we're going to be moving into new territory. And before we do there, I just want to have a really quick recap of the last 2 weeks. We were doing practices and pointing out exercises to awaken awareness, actually, so that awareness becomes conscious of itself, awake to itself, which is really profound aspect of the truth of our being. So awakened awareness is essentially awakening from our identity being experienced through the prism of thought, memory, and self-image. While the awakened heart is awakening from our emotional sense of self, which is essentially defined by emotional experiences in our past, as well as our emotional attachments to separateness in the present. And now we're going to move on to the third aspect of the awakened or the enlightened view, and that is, I call, the awakened ground of being. And the awakened ground of being is awakening to the ultimate foundation and source of our entire experience of being. And as such, the ground of being includes the unity of being experienced by the awakened heart, but it also transcends that unity. So we must always remember that although I am dividing the three aspects of the awakened view into their unique domains of insight, the fully awakened view is actually one view. These three views or sub-views are aspects within the one enlightened view, the one enlightened perception. So that's really important to understand, that even though I'm breaking these down into three kind of unique, let's say, awakened or enlightened views, because they're all there in the overall awakened view, but what we're ultimately aiming for is the view of enlightened perception itself. And so as we go through this ground of being, just keep in mind that it's just the third aspect, the third view of this overall view of enlightened perception. So, while what we ultimately are in our ground of being is beyond description, all I can do is suggest what it might be. But the only final answer to the question, who am I, is found by waking up to the totality of our true nature, by whatever name we're drawn to give it. From the awakened view, only the awakened view itself is the final resolution to the question of who and what I am. That's why this wake-up challenge is almost exclusively focused on practices that can evoke the awakened view. For without the view, all the conceptual understanding regarding our true nature is little more than sophisticated illusions. If we all keep this in mind, then my hope is that perhaps the conceptual pointers that I'm providing during this challenge I hope they'll remain transparent to the reality that they're meant to evoke in you. All right? So that's, I think, important to understand about all these pointers, and even the times when I seem to be talking in a more philosophical sense, that all of that, all this descriptive language really needs to remain transparent. It's pointers toward the truth of your being. So the ground of being is the source and suchness of existence. You can think of it as infinite, unmanifest potentiality. And being the ground and source of existence, it transcends existence thoroughly. And yet it's this ever-present suchness of all, including this very moment where you're encountering my words. And prior to, yet including being and non-being, someone and no one, fullness and emptiness, understanding and ignorance. The divine ground is experienced to be something like, I like to call it the eternal gaze of eternity, intimately close, yet timelessly abiding as the ground of all experience and perception. But grasp at it, and it seems so far away. Enter into the kind of infused wonder of it, and it reveals all of itself in a flash of understanding. So always kind of resist that tendency to grasp at something, because when we're grasping at something, our mind is in the future. We're looking past the immediacy of our own direct experience. And really what we're seeking to do is to awaken to the full nature of this current moment, of what's always and already present. And so to do that, you have to have all of your mind out of the future. It's got to be an investigation of the immediacy of being, right? That's really what it's all about. So the divine ground, it's not only the most difficult to describe, it's also the most challenging to evoke, because in order to get more than a passing glimpse of it, the very roots of the ego structure need to be not simply transcended, they need to be dislodged. So you can have the experience of awakened awareness, and it's a profound and very freeing awakening, without the ego really being dislodged from the center of the experience of being. You often, in that kind of awakening, you transcend it, you go beyond it. When you transcend it, it seems to be gone, it seems to not be there, but you've just transcended it, and at some point you'll kind of come back from the transcendent experience, and guess what will be waiting for you? Whatever's left of your ego structure. So, but the ground of being, it is transcendent, but it's based on more than transcendence of the ego. It's the ego falling out of the center of the experience of being. So if this starts to happen, this will often evoke fear from the ego structure, as well as a kind of deep-seated resistance. This fear is essentially the fear of losing our imaginary ego, along with its imaginary sense of control. But to an ego, this fear seems to be anything but imaginary. For this reason and more, this week's practices, I'm going to be focusing on trying to evoke the somewhat less threatening aspects of the ground of being into awareness. And I say somewhat less threatening because all true and real, for the lack of a better word, experience of the ground of being come at the expense of dislodging the ego structure from the center of one's experience to varying degrees. This dislodging of the ego is called the Great Death in Zen Buddhism, because when the ego is dislodged from the center of consciousness, it's often experienced as a very real experience of death, even though it is in reality only the ego dropping away from the center of one's consciousness. And this experience, this great death experience, is followed by a very real and visceral feeling of rebirth, because it's the birth of the enlightened view taking center stage in our experience of being in a more or less permanent way. And the reason it's more or less permanent is because we're not just transcending the ego, that the ego is finally beginning to give way, to fall out of the center of our experience of being. And because the ego death can sometimes be experienced so viscerally, I'm going to avoid suggesting practices that aim directly at dislodging the deepest roots of the ego during the wake-up challenge, because such practices are best done in the supportive retreat kind of environment under the guidance of an experienced spiritual teacher. And that's not the environment that we're in right now. But needless to say, that this is an experience that can happen spontaneously at any point in one's spiritual life. And if it should ever happen to you, my best general advice is to remember that everything is perfectly okay. And just relax as much as possible and don't try to force anything to happen or resist anything. And also don't get lost in the dream of imagination. Remember that the ego is not who and what you truly are. It's just a construction of your personal psychology, of your mind. And when such a death experience was happening to the Buddha, he simply reached out and touched his hand to the earth, as if to say, "This earth is my support. I trust in its solidity." So I don't want you to get the mistaken idea that everybody has a big death experience or that it's always terrifying or anything like that, because it's not always like that. Nothing is always exactly the same for any two people. It's just that often, people experience some sort of fear when they encounter the infinite unknown within themselves. And some people, although not all, will experience this as a sort of very visceral kind of death experience, a death and rebirth. Of course, this isn't a physical death. That's why ultimately there's nothing to be concerned about. But it's a kind of psychological death, as I said, in the sense of it's the ego falling away from the center of one's consciousness, one's conscious experience of being. So let's kind of dive into here a little bit. So today I'm going to talk about establishing the anchor of the breath, because when you go into this depth of being, you want to have your attention anchored in something that's very concrete. So today we're going to establish the anchor of the breath. It's important when diving into the deepest dimensions of being that we establish something to anchor your experience in. And in the ground of being, we're encountering the mystery of our being in a very, very profound way. There's nothing to hold on to or cling to in our deepest ground. And because of this, our imagination will often project itself into this deepest mystery of being. So we provide an anchor for our attention so that it doesn't become lost within the subtle but sometimes very real feeling projections of the unconscious mind. And entering into the ground of being, it's very much like entering into a deep, dreamless sleep, but in a completely conscious way. And this doesn't mean that I'm encouraging you to go to sleep. Far from it. In this week's practices, you're going to be opening to a dimension of being that is as silent and unmoving as deep sleep, but is actually present in every waking moment if you know where to look for it. So because it's so similar to deep sleep, or can be similar if you get to that depth of being, it's important to have an anchor for your attention to have access to. And that anchor is the breath in the lower part of the belly. While the ground of being